Go for it.
Hello, welcome to Boffer Artillery. I had hoped to bring you a shooting video with the soft kitty engine today, but the weather's been uncooperative since last video I shot, so you're going to have to deal with another talking head episode today. I'm sorry about that. In this episode, we'll be continuing our discussion of motive force by taking a look at some of the rarer period forms of powering a catapult, as well as some purely modern ones. My furry little shop assistant, the Orphan, will be guest starring in today's episode. We've already covered the common types of ways of powering our artillery in the ancient medieval worlds, but those were far from the only ways of hurling heavy objects at people reciting love poetry. First, there is some limited record of the Chinese using rotational energy. Small rocks would be tied to the perimeter of a large wheel. The wheel would be spun at a high speed, and as the wheel spun, the rocks would be accelerated to an even higher speed. A knife fixed to the frame of the machine would cut the strings, allowing the rocks to fly freely towards the enemy. The range of the machine could be adjusted by shifting the angle of the rock at the time that the knife released it. An optimal range would be achieved at about 45 degrees above the horizontal, but you could shorten your range by increasing or decreasing that angle. However, if you wanted to shift your point of aim either left or right, you would have to move the entire engine. Additionally, reloading this piece of machine was quite time-consuming, as you had to tie on numerous additional rocks. So, while we have evidence that this machine was built and tested, there are no records of it actually having seen combat use. Now, we also have records of what are called elliptical spring engines being tested. The Greeks built a two-armed arrow shooting engine that would compress a pair of elliptical springs. These springs were made of bronze, and when the string was rolled, the engine was drawn back. The arms would compress the springs. When the string was released, the springs would push the arms back to their initial resting position and cause the arrow to travel downrange. Philon's treatise, from about 230 to 250 BC, details the construction of this machine, but he also gives us the impression that it was a purely experimental piece. Much like the previous Chinese machine, there's no evidence that this type of weapon ever actually saw combat. But with the availability of high-quality and consistent modern spring steel, this type of machine may be viable for the modern medieval artillerist. The third type of period motive force that we'll be discussing today is steam power. Unlike the previous two entries, there is a limited possibility that this machine saw some combat in period. But if it did, it was still exceedingly rare. A copper or bronze cannon could be cast from a tube, and a supply of water would be held in a boiling chamber beneath the bore and behind where the projectile would sit. As the water would boil, the steam would be trapped behind the projectile, building up pressure, and eventually that pressure would hit a point where it could no longer be contained, and the steam would launch the projectile at a high velocity downrange. Now, due to the difficulties of regulating these machines, they were very limited in their production and use, with their first definite appearance being in the 15th century. Leonardo da Vinci was the first one to produce one with any certainty. However, he attributed his design to Archimedes in the late 3rd century BC. However, there is some reason to doubt this attribution. Now, this type of cannon has actually seen use in combat in the modern world. During the Second World War, there were actually certain types of anti-aircraft cannon that were steam-powered. However, they were far less common than their explosively powered cousins. The next type of motive force that we'll consider is one that I originally expected to be thoroughly modern, but is actually quite ancient. Returning to Philon's treatise on artillery, we find that he describes a pneumatic catapult. Using two precisely and identically made bronze cylinders, a pair of pistons attached to the arms of the catapult would be compressed as the string was drawn back. When the string was released, the air would decompress, pushing the pistons back to their resting position and snapping the arms to their initial position. Philon tells us that this was the most powerful engine built, but that it was never anything more than an experimental piece. Now, if this machine is as powerful as Philon tells us, then why was it never used? There's actually an absolutely horrible episode of the History Channel's Modern Marvels on catapults that refers to this machine as the superweapon of the ancient world. And then they attempt to explain why it was never adopted for military use. And some of the reasons why will become painfully obvious if you actually watch their episode, which, to be honest, I don't recommend. The first reason is that the longest shot that the History Channel made with their machine only had a range of about 70 yards. That's roughly 1/3 of the point accuracy range of a torsion engine from the competing period. And according to Philon, that's only about 1/6 of the distance that can be traveled by a torsion engine's projectile, of roughly 400 yards. So the machine that Modern Marvels claimed was a super weapon was vastly inferior in terms of range to the torsion engine that it would have been competing against. Now, as something of an aside, Modern Marvels' reconstruction was genuinely, truly awful. And Philon's treatise tells us expressly that the pneumatic catapult was intended to throw rocks, not arrows. Perhaps if they had built the machine properly, the History Channel may have had better results. I doubt it, but maybe. Now, early in the 20th century, the German general Erwin Schramm reconstructed one of these pneumatic catapults and actually followed Philon's instructions. In doing so, he found a couple of problems with the machine. First, it was extremely difficult to manufacture two identical cylinders, even with relatively modern methods. Second, the air would leak out of the cylinders due to the lack of an appropriate O-ring, and Philon provided no method for attaching an air compressor or pump to them. Now, attaching a compressor or regulator to each cylinder would actually fix both of these previous problems, balancing the cylinders and allowing you to refill the air. However, it greatly increases the amount of gear that you have to haul around. Furthermore, the cylinders are actually very vulnerable to fouling from dirt and dust as compared to other forms of artillery. Such a problem would make a machine all but useless on campaign. They don't scrub battlefields, after all. Lastly, General Schramm found that the machine would not work if weather conditions weren't almost identical to those when the machine was built. If you think back to high school chemistry and recall the ideal gas law, you'll begin to understand why. If the temperature of the air in the cylinders at the time of shooting was vastly different from the temperature when the machine was built, then the pressure generated would be different. Thus, engines built in the summer, or even in a heated workshop, would have been useless outdoors on the battlefield during winter, or even possibly if it was just a particularly cool evening. On a side note, in order to give the proper Greek name for this machine, General Schramm had to add a new letter to the German alphabet. Now, the vast majority of problems with this type of machine have actually been solved in the modern day, and I hope to do some interviews with a couple of siege engineers who've had success with this type of engine. The next type of motive force is perhaps the most commonly used in Boffer sports: elastic force. These machines are functionally equivalent to a large slingshot. They store their energy in long rubber bands, which are stretched prior to firing. I'm not going to go into a great detail about these today, as Jörg Sprava's Slingshot channel on YouTube already has wonderful content demonstrating how versatile this type of power can be. I recommend particularly the videos where he's launching a bowling ball at a BMW. Elastic force is a completely modern method of powering artillery, but unlike some of the others, it actually has seen combat use. In the trenches of the Great War, British and Australian troops developed a Y-shaped rack that used elastic bands to hurl grenades up to 200 yards. Now, these machines would eventually be replaced by mortars and rifle grenades, but they were an early war solution to the problem of needing to provide high-angle fire on a trench. The last force source we'll discuss today is the extension spring. These are simply springs that snap back to their original length when you stretch them out. Like elastic bands, the use of extension springs is a thoroughly modern method of powering artillery. If you take a one-armed engine, the springs should be attached to the base at one end of the spring and attached to the short arm of the engine at their other end. If you then pull the long arm of the engine downwards, the short arm will rise, causing the springs to stretch. This stores energy in the springs. When you release the long arm after loading it, the springs will snap the short end down and cause the projectile to travel downrange. Now, surprisingly, this type of machine has also seen combat usage. During the Great War, German soldiers made these on the spot in the trenches for hurling grenades. Eventually, the need for them was so great that 4 different designs were being manufactured by German weapons factories. A gentleman from one of the Midwestern Amp-Guard kingdoms has had a great deal of success building one of these machines, and I hope to do an interview with him soon. Now, we've talked about almost all of the types of motive force that have been used in artillery to date. Hopefully this has given you some ideas on how to build your own machines. As always, if you want to know more, links to my books are in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Tschüss!